Hey everyone, welcome back. If you've ever felt like learning English is kind of like trying to beat a really hard level in a video game.
Ooh, I like that analogy.
Right. So, we're doing a deep dive on a recent episode that was basically all about giving you those cheat codes.
I was just going to say shortcuts. It was packed with tips for anyone who's serious about becoming fluent fast.
Totally. And, it really got me thinking about how we can actually make this whole process more, fun. Like less textbook, more like we're actually enjoying ourselves.
Which is key, by the way, because when you're enjoying something, you're way more likely to stick with it.
100%. So picture this. We've got someone who's brand new to English, maybe a little intimidated by the whole thing.
Okay, I can see where you're going with this. Let's call her Sarah.
Perfect. Sarah it is.
Yeah.
She loves music, who doesn't, right? But she's always wanted to understand those catchy English songs everyone's always singing along to.
Been there. I remember when I was learning. Well, never mind. That's another story for another time.
Haha, we'll save that one. But the point is, this whole idea of learning through enjoyment, it's not just about making things more pleasant. It's actually how our brains are wired.
Right. And the podcast we're diving into talked about this concept of immersion, which is basically just surrounding yourself with the language as much as possible.
So for Sarah, our music lover, that might be switching from, say, K-pop to English pop music.
Exactly. And the cool thing about immersion is that it works even when you're not consciously studying.
So even just listening to music can help.
Totally. Think about it. Sarah's passively absorbing pronunciation, rhythm, maybe even some slang, all while jamming to her new favorite tunes.
It's kind of like when we were kids, right? We learned all those nursery rhymes without even realizing we were learning.
Exactly. And speaking of picking things up naturally, the podcast also talked about the importance of mimicking native speakers.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
It's not just about what you say, but how you say it. Like, think about how native speakers use their voices when they ask a question. Their tone usually goes up at the end.
Or how they connect certain words together.
Yes. And mimicking those little things can make a huge difference in how natural and fluent you sound.
So Sarah could even try copying the way her favorite singers pronounce certain words or phrases. It's like a fun way to practice, right?
Exactly. And the best part is, she can literally do it anywhere, anytime. She's just listening to music. What? While Sarah's rocking out to her new English playlist, we've got to talk about another essential ingredient for fluency: vocabulary.
Right, because you can't really get anywhere if you don't actually know any of the words, right?
Exactly. Think of vocabulary as Sarah's toolbox for communication. The more tools she has, the more she can express herself and actually understand what's being said around her.
Okay, that makes sense.
But this podcast made a really important point. It's not about just memorizing endless lists of words.
Oh, I see where you're going with this. It's about understanding how to actually use those words in context, right?
Bingo. And that's where that idea of immersion comes back into play.
So it's not enough to just have a word on a flashcard, right? It needs to actually make sense in a sentence, in a conversation, in real life.
Exactly. Let's go back to Sarah for a sec. Imagine she's watching an English TV show and she comes across a word she doesn't know. She can use the other words around it, what's happening in the scene, even the actor's facial expressions, to figure out what that new word means.
It's like a puzzle.
Totally. And that kind of active learning where you're really engaged, it's way more effective than just trying to memorize a definition.
Right, because you're actually using your brain, not just repeating something over and over.
Exactly. And the podcast had some other great advice about starting with everyday words and phrases, the kind of stuff you'd actually use in a normal conversation.
Which makes sense, right? Sarah's probably going to need the word hello way more often than she's going to need the word...
Ubiquitous.
Okay, first of all, how did you even...
What? I know words.
Okay, fair enough. But yeah, point taken. Start with the basics.
Exactly. Build that strong foundation. And speaking of building, can we talk about grammar for a sec?
Ooh, grammar. Everyone's favorite topic, right?
But actually, this podcast had a really interesting take on it. They were talking about how grammar isn't this scary, confusing thing. It's actually just a set of rules.
Okay, so kind of like learning the rules of a game, then you can actually play.
Exactly. Once you know the rules, you can communicate more clearly and confidently.
Makes sense. But just like you wouldn't expect Sarah to memorize every single rule before she starts playing the new game, she doesn't have to become a grammar expert overnight either, right?
Right. Baby steps. The podcast suggested starting with the basics, like how to build a simple sentence. Subject, verb, object.
So for Sarah, that might be something like Sarah loves English music.
Perfect example. And once she gets that down, she can start to break down and understand those longer, more complicated sentences she's going to come across.
So those basic grammar rules, they're like the key to unlocking a whole other level of English.
Exactly. And as she practices speaking and writing, those rules will become more and more natural, like second nature.
So it becomes less about like thinking about the rules and more about just doing it.
Exactly. Which brings us to, honestly, probably the scariest part for most language learners,
Yeah.
actually speaking out loud.
Oh, yeah, I can relate to that. It's like all of a sudden you forget everything you thought you knew.
Totally. It's that fear of messing up, of sounding silly, maybe even offending someone that could really hold people back.
Yeah, it's like all those eyes on you, just waiting for you to make a mistake.
And that's where the advice from this podcast comes in. Embrace those mistakes. They're not failures. They're actually proof that you're learning and growing.
Okay, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. And they had a ton of practical tips for pushing past that fear and actually opening your mouth and speaking.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, for starters, there are a ton of language learning apps and websites out there that have speaking exercises and interactive activities.
So you can practice with like a robot, basically.
Pretty much. But it's good because it's low pressure. You can build up your confidence before you have to actually talk to a real person.
Right, because let's be real, talking to a computer is way less intimidating than like striking up a conversation with a stranger.
Tell me about it.
Eh.
But remember Sarah, our music-loving English learner. Let's say she's been practicing with those apps and she's feeling a bit more confident.
She's ready for the next level.
Exactly. But now she wants to, actually use her English with real people. And the podcast had some good tips for that too.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Well, they talked about finding a language partner, someone who's also learning English, or maybe joining a conversation group.
So you're kind of all in it together.
Exactly. Everyone's there for the same reason, to practice and improve, so it takes some of the pressure off.
And hey, you might even make some new friends along the way. 2 birds, 1 stone.
Exactly. And you know what else the podcast emphasized? That idea of mimicking, which we touched on earlier.
Oh, right. Like copying how native speakers say things.
Yes. But it's more than just copying individual sounds or words. It's about really paying attention to the music of the language, the rhythm, the intonation, where they stress certain syllables in a word. And this is where things get really interesting for Sarah, our friend, who's trying to learn English. She's starting to notice these patterns in the way native speakers talk.
Yeah, like she's kind of tuning her ear to the music of the language.
Exactly. And as she becomes more aware of those nuances, she can start incorporating them into her own speaking, which will make her English sound more natural and effortless.
Instead of like a robot.
Yeah.
It's like she's learning to dance to the rhythm of the language instead of just stepping on everyone's toes.
I love it. The podcast also had a great analogy about recording yourself speaking. It's like reviewing game footage after a match. You can see what worked, what didn't, and where you can improve.
Oh, that's a good one. So you can actually hear what you sound like to other people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe Sarah notices that she tends to rush through certain words, or that she forgets to pause between sentences.
Or maybe she realizes that she's accidentally picked up like a little bit of an accent from somewhere.
Exactly. And the beauty of recording yourself is that it allows you to pinpoint those areas for improvement and work on them specifically.
It's like having a personal coach in your pocket.
Right. And if Sarah's feeling really brave, she could even share those recordings with a language partner or a tutor for some extra feedback.
Oh, that's a good idea. Get some outside perspective.
Exactly. It ties back to something we discussed earlier, the importance of seeking feedback. Whether it's from a language partner, a conversation club, a tutor, or even just by recording yourself, feedback is essential for growth. It helps you identify those blind spots and make those course corrections that you might not be able to see on your own.
Like having someone else there to tell you if you're going in the totally wrong direction.
Exactly. Now, we've covered a lot of ground here, from immersion and vocabulary building to grammar and speaking practice. But there's one more crucial piece of the puzzle that this podcast emphasized, and it's something that often gets overlooked: consistency.
Oh, yeah. You can't just like cram it all in at once and expect to remember it.
That's right. It's not enough to just dabble in English every now and then. To truly achieve fluency, Sarah needs to make it a regular habit, almost like brushing her teeth or eating breakfast.
It's got to be something you do every single day without even thinking about it.
And this is where that idea of enjoying the process becomes even more important. Because if Sarah dreads her English practice sessions, if they feel like a chore, she's far less likely to stick with it.
It's like if you hate going to the gym, you're probably not going to go very often.
Exactly. We're naturally drawn to things that bring us joy, that make us feel good.
So how can Sarah make her English practice more enjoyable? Any tips from the podcast?
Absolutely. It all comes down to finding what works for her. Maybe she could join an online community of people who share her interest and chat with them in English.
Oh yeah, like a group for people who love to knit or something.
Exactly. Or maybe she could start watching English language movies and TV shows with subtitles, gradually weaning herself off them as her listening comprehension improves.
I actually did that when I was learning Spanish. It helped a lot.
It's a classic for a reason. The key is to make it personal, to find those activities that spark her curiosity and make her want to keep coming back for more.
Because if you're having fun, it doesn't even feel like work.
Exactly. And the more she enjoys the process, the more consistent she'll be, and the more progress she'll make, which will only fuel her motivation even more.
It's a win-win situation all around.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive into this incredible podcast, let's remember Sarah and her journey. Think about what resonated with you most today. Was it the power of immersion, the importance of mimicking native speakers, or maybe the idea of embracing mistakes as stepping stones? Whatever it was, hold on to that insight.
It could be your key to unlocking fluency.
Exactly. And remember, even the smallest step can make a difference. What's one tiny thing you could do today to move a little bit closer to your goals?
Maybe it's finally signing up for that language exchange app you've been thinking about, or even just changing your phone's language settings to English.
The most important thing is to start to take that first step and then keep going. Your fluency adventure awaits.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive, but we'll be back next week with another episode packed with even more tips and tricks to help you master the English language. Until then, happy learning.